The night I found out my husband was stealing from our neighbors, I was standing in our kitchen, holding 2 wine glasses for the charity dinner he was about to host for the very same people he was lying to. At that moment, the whole house looked perfect. The lights were warm, the silver trays were polished, the flowers were fresh. Soft music played from the speaker in the corner. Outside, through the tall glass windows, I could see the lights from the gated community glowing like little stars in the dark. Everything looked rich, calm, safe. Everything was a lie. My name is Elena, and for 8 years, my husband Daniel and I were the couple everyone admired in our neighborhood. We lived in one of those beautiful high-end gated communities where every lawn was trimmed like a magazine cover, every house had a camera at the front door, and every family seemed to have more money than problems. People used to say Daniel and I were the golden couple. They said we were the heart of the community. They said that when something needed to be organized or fixed or funded, everyone could count on us. And honestly, I believed that too. I believed in our life. I believed in our image. I believed in my husband. Daniel was the kind of man people trusted instantly. He had a calm voice, a steady smile, and that rare talent for making every person in the room feel important. He remembered names. He remembered birthdays. He remembered who was sick, who was struggling, who had just lost a parent, whose child had just gotten into college. He volunteered for every charity event. He sponsored every dinner party. He stood at the front of every fundraiser with a glass of red wine in his hand and said things like, "We have to take care of our own." And the neighbors loved him for it. They loved us for it. I was the one who planned the seating charts, ordered the flowers, wrote the thank you cards, and smiled through every event. I was the one who listened when people cried in my kitchen. I was the one who brought soup to new mothers, cookies to elderly couples, and coffee to the neighbor who had not slept in 3 days. We were always the first to show up, always the last to leave. People called us generous. People called us kind. People called us the kind of couple that made a neighborhood feel like a family. And all the while I thought that meant something good. I thought we were building something beautiful. Then one small thing started to feel wrong. It began with Mrs. Whitaker. She lived 3 doors down from us in a white house, with rose bushes out front and a tiny blue bench on the porch. She was widowed, soft-spoken, and always wore pearl earrings, even when she was just watering her plants. One afternoon, she came to my door looking pale and nervous. She held a manila envelope in her hands. "Elena," she said, almost whispering, "did Daniel mention the roofing repair fundraiser?" I frowned. "What fundraiser?" She swallowed hard. "He said the community was collecting donations for residents whose homes were damaged in the storm. He said if I contributed now, the neighborhood association would help cover costs later if anything ever happened to my property." That sounded strange already. Mrs. Whitaker opened the envelope with shaking fingers. Inside was a receipt. It had Daniel's signature on it. The donation had gone through a private account I had never seen before. She looked at me with worried eyes. He said this was the official program. I stared at the receipt, and I felt something small and cold move through my chest. I told her I would ask Daniel. But the moment I closed the door, I already knew this was not a simple mistake. That night, at dinner, I asked him casually, "Did you start some kind of roofing repair program for the neighborhood?" Daniel did not even blink. He set down his fork, looked at me with that calm, warm face he used with everyone, and smiled. "Of course," he said. "We've been helping residents who need emergency support." Mrs. Whitaker must have misunderstood the details. He reached for my hand across the table. "You know how easily people get confused when money is involved." Then he changed the subject, just like that. And because I loved him, because I trusted him, because I had spent 8 years building a life with this man, I let myself believe him. For about a week, then another neighbor, Mr. Alvarez, mentioned something at one of our Sunday dinner gatherings. He was a retired accountant, sharp as a blade, and the kind of man who noticed numbers the way other people noticed faces. He was holding a plate of dessert when he said, Daniel, I tried to check the donation records for that home repair fund. Strange thing. The contact information doesn't match the neighborhood association. Not even close. The room went silent for 1 second. Daniel laughed lightly. Those systems are always messy, he said. You know how nonprofits are. He lifted his glass. We're all just trying to do good, right? People laughed. The moment passed, but I did not laugh. Because I saw something in Daniel's eyes. Not fear, not surprise. Control. Cold, practiced control. That was the first time I felt truly afraid of my own husband. I started paying attention after that. At first, it was little things. A few neighbors would mention giving money for community assistance, but their checks never seemed to go to the same place. Some were told they were funding emergency home repairs. Some were told they were covering medical bills for residents in crisis. Some were told the money was going into a children's enrichment fund. Every explanation sounded noble. Every explanation sounded temporary. Every explanation came from Daniel, and the payments never went through official neighborhood channels. They went through private accounts with names that changed often, accounts I had never seen. Then I noticed how often Daniel disappeared after charity events. He would smile at everyone, shake hands, promise follow-ups, and then he would slip out of the room before the cleanup started. He always said he had calls to make. He always said something urgent came up. He always had a reason. I started checking our files. That was the beginning of the end. At first, I told myself I was just being paranoid. I told myself I was overthinking. I told myself a good wife does not go digging through her husband's business. But the more I looked, the worse it got. I found copies of letters. I found payment confirmations. I found emails with carefully chosen words meant to make people feel safe, grateful, and guilty if they asked too many questions. Daniel had not just been collecting donations. He had been building a long-term scam, a beautiful, polished, patient scam. He targeted people who wanted to help. He targeted people who did not want to seem selfish. He targeted people who trusted him because he lived among them, smiled at them, dined with them, and told them he cared. And the most horrifying part? He was using me too. Not directly. Not yet. But I had been standing beside him at every event. Smiling. Handing out envelopes. Thanking people for their generosity. Making the whole thing look honest. My face had become part of the lie. I remember sitting on the bathroom floor that night, with the papers spread around me, and feeling like I could not breathe. I kept asking myself the same question. How long? How long had this been happening? How many people had given money because they trusted us? How many people had struggled in silence because Daniel convinced them to keep waiting for help that would never come? How many people had been fooled by my smile? I wanted to confront him immediately. I wanted to throw the papers in his face and scream. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way he had manipulated everyone so smoothly. Maybe it was the way he still kissed my forehead like nothing was wrong. Maybe it was because I knew him well enough to understand this. If I rushed him, he would deny everything, destroy the evidence, and make me sound unstable. And if I failed, the neighbors would lose everything. Not just money, hope, trust, dignity. I could not let that happen. So I stayed quiet. For 3 days, I watched him. I watched the way he deleted messages after reading them. I watched him take phone calls out on the patio. I watched him send cheerful replies to people who thanked him for saving them. I watched him host a dinner for the community, passing around expensive food while the people at that table unknowingly toasted the man robbing them. That was the night I understood something terrible. Daniel did not just like control. He needed it. He was not simply greedy. He believed he was smarter than everyone else. He believed people were easy to use if they wanted to believe a good story. He believed kindness was weakness. And because he believed that, he kept going. That same evening, after the guests left, I went to the study and copied everything I could find. Every receipt, every bank transfer, every email, every hidden record. Then I found one file that made my stomach drop. Inside was a list of names. not just donors, targets. That was how Daniel thought about our neighbors. Not as people, as targets. Some were elderly. Some were young families. Some had lost jobs. Some had children with medical needs. He had studied who was vulnerable, who was generous, who was likely to give without asking too many questions. And there, near the bottom of the list, was Mrs. Whitaker. There was a note beside her name. Likely to contribute to home repair appeal. Emotional response expected. Follow-up if needed. I stared at those words until my eyes burned. An old Vidove. A woman who baked lemon bread for the whole block when someone was sick. A woman who kept the community alive with nothing but kindness. And he had reduced her to a strategy. I felt sick. Not just angry. Ashamed. Because I had loved this man. Because I had shared a bed with him. Because I had built my life beside someone capable of this. I knew then that I had a choice. A terrible choice. If I stayed silent, I protected my marriage. If I spoke, I destroyed it. But if I stayed silent, I also protected the lie. And I could not do that. Not anymore. So I started planning. Not revenge. Not drama. Truth. Carefully. Quietly. The first thing I did was protect the innocent people. I made copies of every document and stored them in more than one place. I contacted a lawyer without telling Daniel. I reached out to the bank. I learned which accounts could be frozen before the money disappeared completely. I also reached out to 3 people in the community I trusted most. Mr. Alvarez, Mrs. Whitaker, and a young mother named Stephanie who had recently told me she had donated her daughter's savings account money because Daniel promised it would help the neighborhood childcare room. When I told them I needed to speak privately, they all came to me with worried faces. I sat them down in my kitchen, and for the first time, I stopped smiling. I told them the truth. At first, they did not believe me. That is the hardest part about betrayal. People do not want to believe the person they trusted most could be lying to them. Mrs. Whitaker shook her head and said, "No, not Daniel. He was so kind." Stephanie started crying. Mr. Alvarez said nothing at all. He just looked at the papers with the kind of calm that comes before a storm. I told them everything I had found. I told them Daniel had been using private accounts. I told them the donations were not going where they were promised. I told them their names were on a list. And then I said the thing I had been terrified to say out loud. My husband is running a scam, and I think it has been going on for years. Mrs. Whitaker covered her mouth with both hands. Stephanie cried harder. Mr. Alvarez leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he said, "How many others know?" "Not enough," I said. And that was when we began. Not in public. Not yet. First, we protected people. We called families who had donated the most. We advised them not to make any more contributions. We helped elderly residents check their accounts. We documented every promise Daniel had made. We made sure the innocent people had records showing they had acted in good faith. Because I knew Daniel would try to twist everything. I knew he would say they misunderstood. I knew he would say these were voluntary donations. I knew he would try to disappear the truth beneath charm and polished lies. So we built a wall of facts. Meanwhile, Daniel kept smiling. He kept hosting. He kept talking about community values. He kept acting like he was in total control. And I let him. That may sound strange, but sometimes the smartest thing you can do with a liar is let them believe they are still winning. While he was busy planning the next charity gala, I was meeting with the lawyer. While he was rehearsing his speech, I was preparing the files. While he was congratulating himself on another successful event, I was making sure every person he had fooled would be ready. Then came the night of the big dinner, the one Daniel had planned for months. A perfect event. White tablecloths, gold candles, soft jazz, fancy wine, a guest list full of influential people from the community. He had called it the Neighbors Helping Neighbors Appreciation Night. The irony was almost enough to make me laugh. Almost. That evening, I wore a simple black dress. Nothing dramatic, nothing flashy. Daniel kissed my cheek and said, "You look lovely tonight." I smiled and said, "Thank you." He had no idea that by then, the truth was already in motion. The guests arrived one by one. They admired the flowers. They complimented the food. They told Daniel and me how lucky the neighborhood was to have us. I stood beside him and played my part. I poured drinks. I smiled. I nodded. I listened. And all the while, I watched. I watched the man I had married work the room like a performer who had forgotten there was a stage trap beneath his feet. When he finally stood to speak, he tapped his glass and the room quieted. He thanked everyone for coming. He spoke warmly about generosity. He talked about hardship, compassion, and the beautiful spirit of our community. Then he lifted his glass and said, "This neighborhood has shown what happens when good people come together." A few people nodded. A few people smiled. Then he said, "And tonight, I want to celebrate all of you." That was my cue. I stood up before he could continue. The room turned toward me. Daniel looked at me with mild surprise at first, then annoyance, then suspicion. "Actually," I said, my voice calm, "I think tonight should be about something else." Daniel gave a small laugh, the kind meant to smooth over tension. "Elena, sweetheart, let me finish." But I kept my eyes on the guests. "Before we celebrate," I said, "there are a few things this community deserves to know." The room went still. You could feel the change in the air. Daniel's smile tightened. "Elena," he said again, but now his voice was firmer. I did not look at him. I looked at the people sitting in front of me. Some of you donated money for roof repairs. Some gave for emergency medical help. Some contributed to a children's program that never existed. Some of you were told your neighbors were in crisis and needed urgent support. I took a breath. Those stories were not true. The silence that followed felt endless. Daniel laughed once, sharply. "This is not the time for this." But one of the guests, Mrs. Whitaker's son, stood up. "What does that mean?" I turned toward him gently. "It means the money was not used the way you were told." Daniel's face changed then. I saw it clearly. The charm slipped. The mask cracked. Just for a second. Then he recovered and stepped forward. "This is a misunderstanding," he said. "My wife is upset. She has gotten confused by some private paperwork." I reached into my bag and placed the first folder on the table. "No," I said. "I am not confused." Then I placed the second folder down. "And neither are these bank records." Then the third. "And these emails." Then the fourth. "And this list of names." Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. Daniel stared at the folders like they had insulted him personally. His face had gone pale. The room began to murmur. Someone asked if this was real. Someone else asked how long it had been going on. Mr. Alvarez stood up and asked to see the documents. I nodded. Then one by one, people began coming forward. Not to attack, not to scream, to understand. That is what made the truth stronger than Daniel's lies. His scams relied on confusion. Mine relied on clarity. The more people saw, the more impossible denial became. Daniel tried to interrupt. He tried to speak over me. He tried to grab my arm. I stepped away. He tried to say I was unstable. He tried to say I was manipulated. He tried to say I was having a breakdown. But by then the lawyer had already arrived, and so had the investigator, and so had the evidence, and so had the people he underestimated, because Daniel had made one fatal mistake. He thought everyone in that room was too polite to fight back. He thought kindness meant silence. He thought I would protect him because I was his wife. He forgot that being married to someone does not mean accepting their lies forever. He forgot that love does not cancel conscience. The room exploded into questions. Who knew? How much money? Which accounts? Which families? Where was the money now? How many years? Daniel kept trying to speak, but nobody was listening to him anymore. Not really. For the first time in years, he was no longer the center of the room. He was just a man being seen. Fully. Finally. And that is when people like him lose power. Because the worst thing about a scammer is not the scam itself. It is the story they build around it. Daniel had built a whole identity. The generous husband, the perfect neighbor, the man who cared. But once the facts were on the table, that identity collapsed. I watched it happen, not with joy, not with triumph, with grief. Because the man losing everything in that room was also the man I had once loved. The man I had planned a future with. The man I had trusted with my heart. That kind of loss does not feel clean. It feels like standing in the middle of broken glass and still needing to walk forward. The police were called. The accounts were frozen. The guests were advised to keep every receipt and every message. The community was told to contact the bank and the lawyer immediately. And because we had prepared quietly, because we had worked carefully, nobody lost what could still be saved. Not everyone got every dollar back. I wish I could say they did. I wish I could say truth always arrives in time to repair everything. It does not. Sometimes truth arrives late. Sometimes it arrives after damage has been done. Sometimes justice is not perfect. But that night, it still mattered. Because the lie ended. Because more people were protected. Because Daniel could no longer keep smiling while he fed on the trust of others. Afterward, the neighborhood changed. Not overnight. Not magically. Trust takes time to heal. People were embarrassed. Some were angry. Some were heartbroken. Some felt foolish for believing Daniel. I told them not to. I told them good people are not fools for trusting. The fool is the person who weaponizes that trust. Mrs. Whitaker hugged me in her driveway one morning and cried on my shoulder. Stephanie sent me a text that simply said, "Thank you for saving us before it got worse." Mr. Alvarez told me, "You did the right thing even when it cost you." And it did cost me. Daniel and I did not survive what came next. Our marriage ended. There was no dramatic final speech. No last-minute apology that fixed everything. Only the quiet, ugly truth of what he had done and who he had become. He begged me at first. Then he blamed me. Then he told me I had ruined everything. That was the final insult, really. Not that he had lied to me. Not that he had lied to the whole community. But that even after being caught, he still believed he was the victim. That told me everything I needed to know. I left. And I started over. It was not easy. There were nights I sat alone in a smaller apartment with no grand chandelier, no polished marble counters, no perfect dinner parties. There were mornings I woke up and felt the ache of betrayal before I even opened my eyes. There were moments I missed the man I thought Daniel was. But I did not miss the lie. And I did not miss the life built on it. Today, people still ask me the same question. Why did you do it? Why didn't you protect your marriage? Why didn't you stay quiet? And my answer is always the same. Because a marriage should never ask you to betray your own conscience. Because loyalty means nothing if it requires cruelty. Because love without truth is just another kind of theft. And because the people around me were not numbers on a spreadsheet. They were human beings. Elderly women, young mothers, retired men, families trying to do good. People who opened their hearts and were taken advantage of by someone who knew exactly how to wear a mask. That is what Daniel forgot. And that is what I refuse to forget. So if you are asking me the real question, the one underneath all the others, here is my answer. No, my loyalty to my marriage was not higher than my moral duty to the truth. Not when innocent people were being hurt. Not when lies were being sold as kindness. Not when my silence would have made me part of the crime. I loved my husband, but I loved the truth more. And in the end, that is what saved everyone who could still be saved. May. Because once the lie was gone, I finally got my life back. Not the beautiful one I had been performing. The real one. And the real one, I learned, is worth far more, even if it hurts first. Even if it costs everything. Even if you have to lose the person you thought you knew in order to become the person you were meant to be. That is the story of how I exposed my own husband. That is the story of how a perfect couple fell apart. And that is the story of why the truth, no matter how late it comes, still matters. Especially when it hurts the most. Especially when it costs the most. Especially when everyone else is still pretending not to see it. 'Cause sometimes the strongest thing a woman can do is stand in a room full of smiling lies and say, quietly but clearly, no more.